Bom dia a todos. Good morning to all. Estamos aqui, o Comitê Gestor da Internet está organizando esse ciclo internacional de conferências sobre regulação de plataformas e hoje teremos aqui o terceiro painel. Esse painel de hoje vai tratar das ferramentas antitruste no contexto de regulação de plataformas. O grupo esse que foi formado aqui no Comitê Gestor da Internet para regulação de plataformas iniciou esse trabalho, está iniciando esse trabalho com esse ciclo internacional. Mas, em diante, a gente vai seguir nessa discussão no contexto Brasil, isso vai ser feito aí no segundo semestre. Então, essas primeiras 4 palestras, 4 painéis que estamos fazendo e vão terminar hoje, às 2 da tarde, com um último painel, são assim, o início do processo que a gente está desenvolvendo dentro do Comitê Gestor da Internet para coordenar um debate multissetorial no Brasil, numa perspectiva nacional e da região, dos países em desenvolvimento, sobre essa importante questão que é discutida globalmente, que é super relevante para o futuro, né? Hoje, quem vai moderar o debate é o professor Olavo Chinaglia. Eu vou ler aqui o currículo dele aqui para vocês conhecerem o trabalho dele. Ele é doutor em Direito Comercial pela Universidade de São Paulo. Ele atua há mais de 20 anos com direito econômico, com ênfase nessa área de antitruste, e foi conselheiro do CAD de 2008 até 2012. Ele vai moderar o debate. Eu espero que a audiência, aí, através dos canais do YouTube, possam interagir, colocar as perguntas, que ele vai, ao final da fala dos 2 palestrantes, que são o professor Martín Becerra, da Universidade de Buenos Aires, e o professor Hebert Hovenkamp, da Universidade de Pensilvânia. O Olavo vai fazer a apresentação dos nossos palestrantes de hoje, que eu agradeço muito pela sua participação aqui conosco, né? E vai depois conduzir a parte de perguntas e respostas do público, tá bom? Para quem está assistindo, a gente está no YouTube, tem canais com áudio original. Eu estou falando em português, mas no painel a Martín vai falar em espanhol, e Hovenkamp e também Chinaglia em inglês. Então, podem escolher o canal, tem canal áudio em português, áudio em espanhol, e áudio em inglês e o áudio original. Então, tem diferentes links no YouTube para isso, tá? Bom, eu vou passar a palavra para o professor Chinaglia. Por favor, agora a moderação dos trabalhos é sua. Obrigado, gente.
Muito obrigado, Henrique. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the Brazilian Internet Steering Committee for inviting me to moderate this session. It's a true privilege for me to mediate the discussions among these 2 distinguished professors, Mr. Martín Becerra. He is a principal researcher at CONICET and a tenured professor at the National University of Quilmes and University of Buenos Aires. He is a doctor in information science from the Autonomous University of Barcelona and directs the research program Cultural Industries, Media and Communication Policies in Convergence in Argentina of the UNQ and projects financed by the Ministry of Science, Technology and Productive Innovation. He has consulted for UNESCO, Amnesty International, CELS and other organizations. Professor Hebert Hovenkamp is the James D. Deanan University Professor, Penn Law and the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, and in 2008 received the Justice Department's John Sherman Award for lifetime contributions to antitrust law. His principal antitrust scholarships includes antitrust law with the late Philip Arida and the late Donald Turner, and federal antitrust policy, the law of competition and its practice. His legal history writing includes the opening of American law, enterprise, and American law. So the scope of this session is to discuss the tools offered by antitrust law for the purpose of regulating media and platforms. We're going to discuss what would be such objectives and what would be the limitations of antitrust in pursuing such goals. Just to put these discussions in the context, antitrust law has grounds not only in economy, but also, of course, in law science, in philosophy, and politics. The economic ground for antitrust is well known. Antitrust is a tool for intervention of the state in the economic domain, and it aims at fulfilling market loopholes and breaches. From the legal standpoint, the grounds for antitrust are, in most of the jurisdictions, consolidated in the federal constitutions, and Brazil would not be an exception to this. We have an entire section in our constitution describing the scopes of what we call the economic order, essentially the tools and the limits for intervention of the state in the economy, as I just mentioned. When it comes to philosophy, I understand antitrust as the transposition to the economic domain of the philosophy of the French Revolution. We could understand that the liberty of an economic agent ceases when the freedom of or the liberty of another economic agent would begin. And finally, from the standpoint of politics, antitrust is an instrument for the state to impose limitations to economic power and avoid that it fully transforms into political power. In this context, discussing whether or not antitrust offers good tools to limitate or to determine the role of platforms is absolutely consistent with its ground, its philosophical ground, its political ground, not to mention, of course, the economic and legal grounds. So we're going to start with Professor Martín Becerra. We'll have around 20 minutes to make his initial remarks. Then Professor Hovenkamp will follow with his own remarks on this subject, and we'll then open the floor for questions from the audience. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Martín. Thank you, Professor Hovenkamp.
Thank you, Lavo. Muito obrigado por los organizadores. Eu vou falar en español. Me disculparán por ello. Trataré de hablar lentamente. Igual está la herramienta de la traducción simultánea. Creo que este es un tema fundamental y además de agradecer a los organizadores, lamento que Dina Shrivan-Basan no pudiera asistir a esta conferencia porque también hubiera sido interesante contar con su perspectiva. Voy a tratar de compartir pantalla. Un segundito. Aquí creo que estoy haciéndolo. Entonces, parte de mi intervención está basada en un trabajo que nosotros realizamos con un colega, Guillermo Mastrini, para la UNESCO, que está publicado hace 1 año y medio. El título del trabajo es Medios, Telecomunicaciones e Internet en la perspectiva de la competencia. Creo que la agenda de las autoridades de competencia en los gobiernos y en los poderes legislativos en todo el mundo hoy convoca a esta cuestión, y mi provocación primera y veloz a la pregunta que subyace al título del panel es que hay que superar efectivamente los límites y avanzar en grandes posibilidades, ampliando el enfoque de competencia actual, que es un enfoque estrecho, para pensar las perspectivas antitrust en el marco de la plataformización de Internet. Nosotros en el trabajo que mencioné, que hicimos con Mastrini, entrevistamos a más de 10 autoridades de la competencia de 10 países latinoamericanos diferentes, y las respuestas al planteo que nosotros le hacíamos a estas autoridades de la competencia, si correspondía actuar ante la posición dominante de las plataformas en el discurso público, en la extracción y manejo de datos personales, fueron mayoritariamente negativas, hace 2 años solamente. Estoy seguro que hoy una consulta a las mismas autoridades arrojaría un resultado diferente. Ciertamente, en el medio hubo grandes escándalos relativos a abusos con contenidos, con datos personales, con cuentas de presidentes, como puede ser Jair Bolsonaro, o el expresidente Donald Trump, o el presidente Maduro, documentación de competencia desleal en el mercado publicitario mayorista y minorista, evidencia de daño a consumidores y usuarios. No resulta sorprendente que en 2021 las autoridades de la competencia revisen el temperamento frente a los protagonistas de la plataformización de Internet. El desafío de los reguladores, tanto de medios de comunicación, de datos personales, de telecomunicaciones, es incorporar los conceptos y métodos de la competencia a raíz de la convergencia tecnológica, de la irrupción y de la disrupción tecnológica en el sector de las comunicaciones. Y el desafío para las autoridades de la competencia es comprender la especificidad de los recursos de información, comunicación, cultura, y la diferencia que existe entre datos e información. Creo que hay ciertamente planteos divorciados. Por un lado tenemos las teorías de la competencia, las políticas antitrust, con distintos acentos a los que me voy a referir en un minuto. Por otro lado tenemos la teoría democrática, que está asentada en la idea de la diversidad y la pluralidad de emisores, de voces, de perspectivas, o sea que está relacionada de alguna manera con la competencia en la arena pública, con la apertura a la libre concurrencia a la arena pública para participar de la conversación pública. Y por otro lado, la familia, vamos a decir, de protección de privacidad, de datos personales. Si lo vemos de esta manera, en general los estados, incluso los entes supraestatales, como puede ser la Comisión Europea, tienen regulaciones legales diferenciadas, unas para competencia, otras para libertad de expresión, contenidos, otra para datos personales, privacidad. Claro, estas 3 familias están hoy por hoy amalgamadas, están reunidas e imbricadas en un mismo objeto, que son las plataformas. La especificidad comunicacional e informacional alude al acceso a la cultura, a la libertad de expresión, a la privacidad, a la protección de datos personales, a la honra, a la no discriminación. O sea, son derechos que pueden ser potenciados o lesionados en función del tipo de competencia que exista en el marco de la convergencia en información y comunicación. Y obviamente, como ya fue dicho, la concentración excesiva, lo dijo Olavo recién, en las redes altera toda la cadena productiva de medios, de telecomunicaciones, de Internet, y por lo tanto las buenas prácticas deben considerar especificidades y armonizar los principios de defensa de la competencia, de protección de privacidad de datos personales y de estímulo de la conversación pública y de la libertad de expresión. Tenemos tradiciones antitrust, también aludidas en la introducción. Brevemente, diremos desde la ley Sherman de 1890, la ley Clayton de 1914, hay una profusa y yo diría vigorosa tradición, sobre todo en los Estados Unidos, que ha iluminado en este sentido parte de la tradición regulatoria legal que se fue incorporando en los distintos países a lo largo del siglo XX. En América Latina, tardíamente esto ocurrió, sobre todo a partir de la década de 1990, o sea, en la última década del siglo XX, cuando, por ejemplo, Brasil, o la Argentina, o Colombia, y otros países latinoamericanos instituyeron autoridades de la competencia y leyes de defensa de la competencia, un poco inspirados en aquella tradición que en el sector de las comunicaciones tuvo casos que son emblemáticos, en algunos casos tempranos, en otros tardíos, con, por ejemplo, el caso Viacom-CBS de 1970, el tema de AT&T en los 80, el caso que fue tramitado y que fue como inicial en la apertura al uso civil y comercial de Internet con Microsoft en la década de 1990, tiene la inercia de esa tradición, pero es una tradición que fue interrumpida a partir del famoso trabajo de Robert Bork, de la paradoja antitrust, que obviamente introduce otra perspectiva que debilitó el alcance de los principios de la competencia, sobre todo en el ámbito de las comunicaciones. Dicho esto, la tradición de los Estados Unidos es diferente a la tradición europea, como también sabemos, donde en Europa primero las autoridades sectoriales analizan abusos eventuales sobre, o la situación, diagnostican la situación sobre, por ejemplo, en materia de medios, sobre pluralismo, diversidad, libertad de expresión, en materia de datos personales, sobre datos personales, privacidad, y luego actúa defensa de la competencia para eventualmente sancionar eventuales distorsiones a la competencia, distorsiones al funcionamiento del mercado. En Estados Unidos, esto último lo hace el Poder Judicial. Además, en Europa, la preocupación sobre diversidad y pluralismo no se reduce al examen de las barreras de entrada que pueda ofrecer un competidor. En Estados Unidos es menos común analizar esas barreras de entrada y es más común analizar cómo afectan a los usuarios finales en la provisión del servicio y sobre todo en precios. O sea, sobre todo es una mirada, a mi modo de ver, estrecha, que contempla el impacto sobre precios al consumidor en un mercado determinado, con una consideración también limitada sobre cuál es el mercado relevante. Y este es, como todas las expertas y expertos en materia de competencia conocen, un tema central y yo diría definidamente político, digamos, ¿no? Hoy en día las autoridades de la competencia aplican criterios de dudosa eficacia que no funcionan claramente, por ejemplo, con la adquisición de WhatsApp por parte de Facebook, con la adquisición de YouTube por parte de Google, y además hay una manifiesta falta de intervención ex ante para tramitar luego políticas de hechos consumados que son muy complicados de revertir. Se han relajado tanto las pruebas necesarias para establecer prácticas antitrust y se ha abandonado la intervención ex ante, que prácticamente ya nadie queda alcanzado por los dictámenes y las políticas antitrust. Y esto conduce a una pregunta que es una pregunta elemental. ¿Puede haber competencia sin competidores? En mercados digitales, de la economía digital, con efectos de red, es muy difícil que encontremos auténtica competencia en cualquiera de los segmentos que podamos analizar en la economía digital. Entonces, por otro lado, como por cierto Lina Khan ha documentado en su trabajo sobre Amazon, una mayor competencia en el corto plazo puede reducir la competencia en el mediano y largo plazo, incluso erosionando a los consumidores. Esta semana, la demanda del fiscal general del Distrito de Columbia en Estados Unidos, Racine, sobre Amazon, respecto de que entre el 50 y el 70% de las ventas de comercio electrónico en Estados Unidos da resultado precios más altos al consumidor, es también una prueba de que han fallado todos los controles previos, todas las etapas previas de examinación de este tipo de casos, ¿no? O sea que hay cada vez más consenso en que algo ha funcionado mal en la evaluación de los principios de la competencia por parte de las autoridades, y que el poder de los gatekeepers tras las fusiones, adquisiciones y concentraciones de mercado no ha sido realmente considerado. De hecho, hay un error fundamental, lo mencionaba antes, en la consideración de qué es el mercado relevante en el contexto de la convergencia de información, de mercados de información y comunicación. Es decir, ¿cuál es el mercado relevante en la fusión Disney y Fox? ¿Son los contenidos infantiles? ¿Son los contenidos deportivos? ¿Son los contenidos de interés relevante, la información general? ¿Es la publicidad tradicional? ¿Es el mercado mayorista de publicidad? ¿Es la publicidad digital? ¿Son las señales de televisión de pago? ¿Es el mercado laboral? ¿Es el sector de streaming y over the top, audiovisual y video on demand? ¿Es la extracción, almacenamiento, cruce y comercialización de datos? ¿Es todo esto junto? Bueno, las autoridades de la competencia, por lo menos en México, en Brasil, en Colombia, que han intervenido en esta fusión Disney y Fox en América Latina, han tomado, en algunos casos parcialmente, en otros casos han intentado examinar la totalidad de estas distintas pautas que tiene la fusión en curso, ¿no? Entonces, esta idea de mercado relevante, junto con el problema de los efectos de red, digamos, que conduce a lo que el grupo sueco ABBA llamaba, ¿se acuerdan? The Winner Take It All, digamos, ¿no? O sea, está ejemplificado con esta canción del grupo sueco. Bueno, obviamente pone, digamos, nos evidencia que hay barreras significativas de entrada y que las asimetrías que derivan de esos efectos no son corregidos hasta ahora por la intervención que han tenido estrecha, como decíamos, las autoridades de la competencia. De hecho, voy a citar un artículo de The Economist, donde señalaba que el enfoque actual de defensa de la competencia está aquejado de tres grandes problemas. El primero, dice, es la falta de curiosidad, ¿no? Dado que no relacionan en sus análisis técnicos las tasas de ganancia extraordinaria, los altos y persistentes rendimientos de capital, las adquisiciones y fusiones, con la disminución de nuevos participantes y concurrentes y abuso de posición dominante. O sea, es como si todos estos fenómenos fueran fenómenos meteorológicos, fenómenos naturales que ocurriesen sin relación directa de unos con otros. Por eso digo, una mirada de economía política relaciona obviamente todos estos procesos que están efectivamente relacionados. El segundo problema que menciona este artículo es la falta de claridad, porque la definición misma de competencia está en entredicho, más allá de la tautología de que lo que es bueno para los consumidores es bueno para el mercado en general, y al poner énfasis solamente en el precio al usuario final o al consumidor final, con la mirada enfocada en el supuesto bienestar del consumidor, se omite que los consumidores pueden sufrir incluso en mercados donde los precios caen, y además en muchos mercados actuales, como sabemos, no hay precio. O sea, el precio es el pago que realizamos en especias en materia de datos personales que las usuarias y los usuarios resignamos para tener una mejor experiencia, para ponerlo en palabras de Henry Jenkins, en el mercado de la convergencia. Y el tercero es que los reguladores de la competencia, en algunos casos, han sido capturados directamente por los actores más importantes del mercado, digamos, lubricando un mecanismo de puerta giratoria entre el sector público y empresas privadas, ¿no? Para ir cerrando, me gustaría plantear algunos desafíos, oportunidades, digamos, del cambio que se percibe en los últimos tiempos en el enfoque de competencia a raíz de la evidencia reunida en los últimos por lo menos 5 o 7 años de comportamiento de economía digital. El primero es reconocer que la comunicación es un bien fundamental para la democracia, con externalidades que no pueden ser completamente captadas por criterios economicistas de abordaje neoclásico de la teoría de la competencia al uso de Robert Bork. El segundo es la necesidad de que las agencias, tanto sectoriales como las agencias de competencia, los reguladores sectoriales y las agencias de competencia, cuenten con una perspectiva antitrust, con conocimiento específico del sector de las comunicaciones y de sus cruces convergentes, para superar la mirada estrecha de que la competencia puede ser analizada y promovida con los mismos instrumentos para todos los mercados. No es lo mismo el mercado del acero o el mercado de ferrocarriles, digamos, transporte en ferrocarril, que el sector de datos personales, de medios de comunicación, de telecomunicaciones. En tercer lugar, es preciso que las autoridades de defensa de la competencia implementen estrategias de construcción de conocimientos, capacidades y recursos intelectuales para que sus cuadros administrativos y directivos estén familiarizados y sean conscientes de los alcances de esta temática en relación a los derechos de acceso a la cultura, a la libertad de expresión, al pluralismo y a la protección de sus datos personales y privacidad. Asimismo, es importante que reguladores y autoridades de competencia desarrollen con análisis y actuaciones ex ante, no solo ex post, dado que si actuaran solo ex post, es muy difícil corregir las asimetrías que se vuelven estructurales. La promesa de la precandidata demócrata a la presidencia estadounidense, la senadora Warren, de partir Facebook, era una promesa que podía ilusionar a muchos, o ilusionarnos a muchos, pero que es muy difícil de concretar, obviamente. Asimismo, recomendar una labor proactiva de abogacía de la competencia en el sector infocomunicacional. Esto complementa las actuaciones ex ante, para que sea esa labor de abogacía de la competencia y que tenga carácter vinculante, digamos, ¿no? Que sea una labor que tenga efectiva realización en las políticas de competencia. Asimismo, la convergencia de información y comunicación obliga a revisar completamente el concepto de mercado relevante. En la Argentina, por ejemplo, en el gobierno anterior, en la Argentina la autoridad de la competencia depende del Poder Ejecutivo, no es completamente independiente, y en el gobierno anterior del expresidente Mauricio Macri se autorizó la mayor fusión de la historia de las comunicaciones en América Latina, que es la fusión protagonizada por accionistas del Grupo Clarín entre Telecom y Cablevisión. Ahí, el dictamen de la Comisión de Defensa de la Competencia, dependiente del gobierno, del Poder Ejecutivo, sobre lo que es mercado relevante, es un caso emblemático de lo que no se debe hacer, de lo que está mal hecho, digamos, ¿no? Ya voy completando. La particularidad, por otro lado, de las redes sociales, que en su mayoría no implican el pago de un precio por participar, desafía a la teoría de la competencia que mide la satisfacción del consumidor por dicha variable. En las redes sociales no es fácil encontrar, además, servicios sustitutos, ya que el valor para el usuario se incrementa cuanto más gente participa. Como se ha mostrado en el caso de Facebook, se han observado también, obviamente, y también de Google, prácticas anticompetitivas en el ámbito de la privacidad. Es menester considerar que las opciones de sustitución no están disponibles para todos los usuarios y consumidores de bienes y servicios de información y comunicación por igual. Ejemplo, el 0 rating que tiene WhatsApp en América Latina por los operadores de telecomunicaciones hace que el servicio de mensajería de Facebook no encuentre un sustituto simple, y por eso el cambio de las reglas de privacidad, de la política de privacidad de Facebook en WhatsApp de estos meses, tiene un impacto tan relevante sobre el mercado de mensajería en América Latina. Finalizo señalando, tenía algunas recomendaciones más, pero entiendo que estoy llegando al límite del tiempo. Creo que la expansión regional y global de los mercados de información y comunicación también demandan otro desafío, que es enfatizar los esfuerzos de cooperación e integración para la aplicación extraterritorial de las normas de competencia. El problema jurisdiccional con actores que en muchos casos ofrecen servicios y registran actividad económica en un país, pero que no tienen sede en el mismo, o que tributan en otro país, es parte de una agenda pendiente en materia de regulaciones específicas para estimular la competencia en un sector que hasta ahora ha tenido muy poca competencia. Muito obrigado, muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Becerra. It was a very interesting presentation. And I think that when we open the floor for debates, you'll be able to complete your suggestions, all right? Well, now I'll open the floor to Mr. Professor Hebert Hovenkamp. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you to the authority for having me. I look very much forward to this conference, and thank you to Professor Becerra for his remarks. I'm going to give you mainly the U.S. antitrust perspective, a little bit about what is going on in the U.S. with respect to the large digital platforms in light of what I think to be the proper set of goals for antitrust. And in order to do that, I'm going to share my screen as well. So here it comes. Okay, I hope you can see it now. The goals of the antitrust laws in the United States are somewhat in dispute, but I'm going to suggest a goal that I think is both defensible and practical, not necessarily easy. And that is that the goal of the antitrust laws should be to further maximum output in the markets to which it applies, consistent with sustainable competition. That goal favors consumers who are best off as output is maximized because it brings low prices, brings a high degree of information, better product quality, and the like. It also benefits labor, which is benefited by large output that creates job opportunities. It benefits many input suppliers, although there the story is a little bit more complicated, and I'll try to get back to that a little later on. I would reject such alternative goals as the competitive process, which is articulated by some of my American friends. I don't think it really means anything, and it doesn't provide any measurable criteria for assessing an antitrust policy. It's also been used widely by both the far right and the far left. Indeed, if you look through the case law, it's the conservatives who have used the term competitive process more than liberals, but liberals are starting to pick it up as well today. But my objection is mainly that that term can mean pretty much anything that you want it to mean. And then I think we need to avoid two extremes. One is the idea that the platforms are doing just great and everything is just perfectly fine. But the other one is that the platforms are inherently monopolistic, and the only way we can really deal with these problems is to break them up. I see the relationship between antitrust law and the two extremes as an inverted U. The goal of the antitrust laws is high output, as measured by the vertical axis on this picture. The problem with both the neoliberal under-enforcement position and the neo-Brandeisian excessive enforcement position is that they both favor reduced output, but for different reasons. Under-enforcement produces high profits, As a result, less demand and lower output. Over enforcement often leads to the lack of very important efficiencies. And so my own view is that we should favor an antitrust policy somewhere in the middle. In keeping that in mind, I think we have to remember a couple of things. The platforms have, in fact, been significant engines of economic growth. We talked today about the internet economy, and the large digital platforms have made their contribution to that. And we always need to keep that in mind. On the other hand, their history with smaller firms is complex, and as I will get to in a little bit, they are probably guilty as well of many anti-competitive practices. Historically, they are not yet shown to be more durable than the other traditional monopolies in United States markets, like US Steel, IBM, Xerox. As recently as 10 or 15 years ago, writers were speaking about MySpace, the predecessor to Facebook, as if it were a permanent natural monopoly. And of course, it was displaced by Facebook. If they're not natural monopolies, then they require exclusionary practices in order to survive. So I think, one of the things in my view is that we need to identify exclusionary practices and not break them up simply because they are very big firms. Another thing to keep in mind is that they are probably not winner-take-all markets to the extent that product differentiation is available, and in most cases it is. So for example, just to take Facebook as an example, is Facebook a winner-take-all market? Well, if the question is, could you enter the market with a clone, with something that looked exactly like Facebook looks? I think the answer is clearly no. Network effects are much too substantial. Facebook has far too big a head start, so a lookalike is not going to be able to enter that market. On the other hand, a differentiated entrant can enter the market, and we have examples of that. Twitter, which has become very successful, TikTok, which is emergent and younger, but is also has also proven to be quite successful. And I think there will be other differentiated entrants. So the key to entry in many of these internet markets is through product differentiation. And indeed, the Federal Trade Commission acknowledges that in its Facebook complaint, and its antitrust complaint against Facebook, that the new entrants are likely to be product differentiated firms. I think this approach also explains why Google Search has been a relatively successful dominant firm. It continues to have market shares above 90%. It certainly does engage in a certain number of potentially exclusionary practices, including large payments to Apple to be the default search engine. But one of the problems with search engines is that differentiation has proven to be more difficult than it has been with something like Facebook or other Google products or Amazon, which are much more susceptible to innovation. On the question of market power, there's a vast economic and legal literature on how you measure market power, how much market power is necessary. One clear source of market power is, of course, network effects. That is to say, as networks get larger, their value increases, and as a result, a smaller competitive network would be at a disadvantage. But once again, here there are a couple of offsetting things. One is multi-homing. Many network industries are subject to multi-homing, which means customers can access two or more different services and switch among them at fairly low cost and fairly quickly. And the other one is product differentiation. Once again, there are many two-sided platforms that are much more competitively structured. Those include magazines, newspapers, dating sites. You think about a dating site, right? You want, on a dating site, normally you would think that if this is a traditional dating site with men looking for women, that you'd want a dating site with the largest number of women. Women would want a dating site with the largest number of men. So why is it we don't have one single dating site that covers everybody? And the answer is that dating sites are in fact very differentiated from one another. They appeal to various groups by ethnicity, by politics, by preferences for food, pets, sexual practices, and so on. And as long as those things are true and different dating sites can appeal to them, we will probably continue to have competition in the dating site market. On market definition, if some of you have been following it, we've had this lengthy trial now between Epic Games and Apple, and one of the principal issues in that case was market definition. Epic Games would like to have a market definition limited to the Apple iPhone platform. And of course, if that is the market definition, then Apple would have a 100% market share. Apple, on the other hand, looks at the fact that Epic Games can be used on the iPhone, on Android phones, on both of the major game consoles, PlayStation and Xbox, and also on traditional laptops and desktops. And indeed, if you aggregate all of the platforms on which Epic Games can be played and installed, Apple's market share drops to something like 10%. So as we are talking, the judge is considering how the market definition ought to play out in the Epic Games case. I think we need to think much more about the use of cluster markets in dealing with the platforms, particularly for products such as Facebook and Amazon, perhaps Google. A cluster market, markets normally consist of close substitutes, but the feature of a cluster market is that it groups together services or products that are literally not in competition with each other for purposes of analysis. Generally, it does that when there are economies of joint provision. It's cheaper to offer multiple things together than to offer one, or users prefer to have multiple products or services on the same platform. So this will be an issue in the Facebook litigation that the Federal Trade Commission filed late in 2020. The motion to dismiss in that case alleges that the market that the Federal Trade Commission alleges is incoherent because it groups together all of these various non-competing services that Facebook offers. And I think one of the questions will be whether the act of clustering multiple services together serves to create a cost reduction or a competitive advantage that justifies the use of of a market that includes non-competing products. I think one of the great tragedies in US antitrust law right now is that the US Supreme Court has been hostile toward direct measures of market power, econometric measures of market power, which the Supreme Court rejected in the American Express case for vertical practices. And of course, most of the practices we're talking about with respect to the platforms are vertical. It's not to say that residual demand is easy to measure. It presents some significant difficulties in zero price markets, but nevertheless, it is possible. It's the preferred mechanism for measuring power among many economists. It's very data intensive, but one feature of platform markets is that their transactions are digitized. So the data are usually within reach. For example, I believe direct measurement of market power would be useful in the Epic Games case because they're not zero price markets. They're markets in which Apple is obtaining royalties, and as a result, econometric measures of demand responses to price changes at given margins would be quite easy. However, I believe the case is going up under the assumption that under the American Express rule, market power is going to have to be addressed in terms of a relevant market. Excuse me, of course, market power requires an entry barrier. And here, I think one of the biggest single problems with respect to the large digital platforms is their ongoing repeated acquisitions of small, nascent startup firms. They have acquired them in the hundreds, and pretty much everybody knows what's going on. They're trying to prevent competition by buying up startups as soon as they come into existence in order to keep a competitor from emerging. And indeed, in the Facebook complaint by the FTC quotes some documents and emails from Facebook with respect to the acquisition of Instagram, suggesting that Facebook acquired Instagram in order to exclude it from the market as an independent entrant. So if there's one thing to do that I think would further competition in the platform market without limiting technological growth, I believe it would be to have a much harsher rule governing internet mergers in which the acquiring firm is a large internet platform. In terms of anti-competitive conduct, I don't think we should be going after the platforms simply because they are very large. We do not have a law of no-fault monopoly in the United States, and I don't agree with those people that believe we should have. On the other hand, I think there are plenty of anti-competitive practices to go after. One is a set of practices that I would characterize roughly as quasi-exclusive dealing, but all kinds of preferential agreements that now Amazon, once again in a recent case brought by the Attorney General of Washington, D.C. against Amazon. Google has similar restrictions on advertising, as does Facebook, and as does Apple. Refusal to deal has reemerged as an antitrust issue, at least at the academic discussion level. The courts have been hostile, led by the Supreme Court. But one of the very interesting things about the Epic Games case last week is the judges repeated asking of questions about the relevance of major unilateral refusal to deal cases in the United States, including Aspen skiing, which found a refusal to deal unlawful. The Terminal Railroad case, more than 100 years old, which condemned an unlawful refusal, and then also Trinco, which refused to condemn it. And a fair belief that today's Supreme Court would be antagonistic to the development of any expansion of the law of unilateral refusal to deal. However, it is one of the principal complaints that Epic Games made against Apple, and Apple has already filed a special motion to dismiss on that one count of the complaint that alleges that the Apple platform is an essential facility, and as a result, Apple has a duty to share it. I think a more promising line of litigation involves most favored nation, or MFN clauses. The case brought against Amazon just this week. Also cases that have involved Google, Facebook with advertising, and so on. These are situations that involve contracts in which the dominant firm insists on getting a better deal from some supplier than other firms get. So for example, Amazon, it is alleged, deals in products supplied by third parties and has in its contracts with these suppliers requirements that they will not sell to competing platforms who sell them at a lower price than Amazon. In the presence of power, those could very easily be subject to condemnation, although I think the better remedy for such conduct is an injunction against the conduct and not a breakup of the firm. And finally, use of defaults, which comes up quite frequently with respect to Google, although it's also relevant with respect to Apple. Google pays Apple a very large sum of money, $7 or $8 billion a year, it is reported, to make Google search the default search engine on Apple. And that is being challenged as anti-competitive. There may be a link between the very large payment that Google pays to Apple and Google Search's very large market share. And in addition to that, Google's licensing restrictions with respect to Android phones and the Google Play Store also require, as a practical matter, at least in the US, that Google Search be the default search engine. So, critics of Google Search say that the reason Google Search has the 90% market share that it has is these payments plus some other exclusionary contracts. Google Search is more likely to say it's a couple of things. One is that it's the biggest because it's the best and more consumer-friendly search engine. And the other one is that it is, in fact, a natural monopoly. And it is the best search engine because it has a very large installed base of both customers and information. One of the problems in US law is that our current law of tying arrangements does not reach defaults. That is to say, a default is not a true tie. For example, in the Apple case, when Apple makes Google Search the default search engine on the iPhone, it's not a true tie because although it's the default search engine, any customer who wishes can substitute a different search engine or multi-home on search engines, which means you can install multiple search engines on your iPhone. I have an iPhone. I have 5 or 6 search engines that I use. And current American law with respect to tying requires that the products be tied, and a simple default, that is a simple preference for one over something else, does not constitute a tie. And then finally, a little bit on effective remedies. Here's where I caution a little bit of a conservative approach. As I said earlier, the platforms are major contributors to economic growth. We have a very large interest group in the United States, kind of at the progressive or leftish end of our antitrust, who are very strong about breaking up the platforms. I think you need to be very, very careful before you break up platforms insofar as we're talking about internally developed assets. Now, I would distinguish acquired assets, and indeed the Federal Trade Commission's complaint against Google cites 2 of those acquired assets. One is Instagram and one is WhatsApp. They were acquired 8 or 10 years ago. They have not been fully integrated into the Facebook platform. And I think that the breaking up or the reversing of anti-competitive mergers is a viable and valuable antitrust remedy. However, if we're talking about things that are internally developed, we may end up paying a very high price in terms of consumer satisfaction and efficiency if we simply start to break things up. Another remedy that has been proposed is line of business restrictions governing mainly Amazon. one of the proposals is that Amazon be segregated from its third-party sellers. So in other words, Amazon could put its own internally produced products like Amazon Basics products on one website, but it would have to put all of the products sold by third-party merchants on a different website. I also think that's a very bad idea. And the main reason for that is that the presence of both Amazon products and third-party products on the same website furthers competition and produces lower prices in many, many cases. For example, I'll give you one example. Amazon sells its own batteries under the Amazon Basics brand. I'm talking about just ordinary household batteries like AAA batteries or 9-volt batteries. It sells those under the Amazon Basics brand. It also sells brands such as Duracell. And if you do a search for batteries, you'll find both of them right next to each other. And that kind of competition, the Amazon Basics batteries are usually cheaper than the brand name batteries. That kind of competition forces the price of the brand names down. And indeed, it's no different in principle than the widespread practice in physical stores, which is now a half century old, of using house brands in competition with highly advertised name brands. You give the consumer the option of lower prices, and segregating the platforms makes that competition much more difficult. So I would not be in favor of those types of restrictions. I do believe that a promising set of restrictions is compelled interoperability, which enlarges the range of network effects across more firms, and as a result can improve rather than diminish consumer satisfaction. And here, of course, the principal model for such a breakup is in the United States is the telephone system, AT&T, where the telephone system was in fact broken up both horizontally and vertically into 7 baby bells. It was segregated from its instruments and segregated from its then existing long distance services. However, under the supervision of the court initially, and then later on by statute, interoperability was compelled across the entire system. And as a result, there was room for smaller players. Nobody wants to run a telephone system that cannot interconnect. And so with interoperability, you can get many of the advantages of a large network and further competition inside the network. And so then let me just conclude by saying that we should not underestimate the utility and value of properly designed injunctions. Injunctions are considered by some people to be dull and old-fashioned. Well, we've been giving injunctions for centuries, but the fact is that a properly tailored injunction can bring to an end many of these anti-competitive practices, and that, coupled with harsher treatment of anti-competitive mergers, I think, would go a long way to making the platforms more competitive without doing things that are potentially highly destructive, such as breaking them up. Okay, I think I've used up my time. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and I will release my screen.
Thank you very much, Professor Hovenkamp. It was likewise Martín Becerra's presentation was a very intriguing and provocative set of remarks. And well, I'd like to apologize to both of you, the panelists, for the unsympathetic messages alerting that we were reaching our time. But I was eager to open the floor to the audience questions. And I will allow myself to start with a general remark inspired by some comments I received, and particularly Mr. Ademir Monteiro has mentioned, the lack of ability of antitrust enforcers worldwide to regulate both the traditional economy, meaning, let's say, the offline sectors of economy, and what would be even worse, an aggravated problem when it comes to online business models, which are new to all of them. I would have two thoughts on this, or inspired on this. First, and this would connect to Mr. Becerra's presentation, there is indeed a point of contact between the traditional media and the new media platforms. Business models that are at the very bottom based on revenues originated from advertising. Open TV and any other media, newspapers, magazines, and the online platforms as well, they take advantage of the fact that they reach a huge amount of people, and then they can bring advertising messages to those individuals. And Mr. Hovenkamp has called our attention to the fact that online platforms is, let's say, a gender that would allow many different species. We have platforms that aim at specific niches of the consumer's market, and platforms with completely different purposes. So what would be the common point among all these platforms? And that could be, let's say, the leading direction for antitrust enforcers worldwide to develop antitrust, or to apply antitrust tools in a more effective way. And I would like to listen to your thoughts on this. What is the main competitive driver among platforms? Is the ability to read the customers or the consumer's behavior, to anticipate the consumer's behaviors, so that the advertising can be directed and then becomes more effective. So what all the platforms would have in common is the strategy, or that they need to have some strategy to gather information about the consumer's preferences. I was thinking about the Google situation. We normally think of Google as a very dominant, but a super dominant firm that would be, let's say, hardly face any competition. But if we look from the historical perspective, Google was not the first search engine. We had, before Google, for instance, we had Yahoo. And what makes Google so different from the other search engines, my opinion, is the fact that Google incorporated other strategies of gathering information about people's or consumers' preferences. Google Earth and the acquisition of YouTube, all of these initiatives were part of the same strategy of developing ways and tools to anticipate, to predict what would be the behavior of the customers. So at the end of the day, should the competition enforcers worldwide try to learn how to read or interpret the consumer's behavior in order to maybe come up with different antitrust policies to address this kind of business that we are discussing here? Or would it be utopic to think that we would have one solution to fit all the problems? after I hear your thoughts, then I would have a new or another question. It comes from Mrs. Alice Maria Costa. She's actually mentioning that the role of antitrust could, or at least should, incorporate concerns with data privacy and could serve to the individuals as a tool to restrain access to their own personal information. Do you think that this is feasible? And if so, what would be the actual measures to be taken in order to allow antitrust to perform this role? And I will allow anyone among the professors to share the thoughts. I don't know.
Please, Professor Hebert, if you want to begin.
Professor Becerra, why don't you go first, and I'll say something.
Okay. So let me say that. Sorry, I will speak in Spanish because I am more confident in Spanish. Sorry. Voy a juntar ambas preguntas, la intervención de Olavo y las preguntas que se han hecho, porque creo, en primer lugar, que sí es utópico, pero es tiempo de plantearse esa utopía, porque pensémoslo a la inversa. Si no hay una conjunción de una perspectiva que una competencia y datos personales, si esa conjunción no ocurre, entonces no va a haber competencia en los mercados digitales. Estoy completamente de acuerdo con la presentación y la perspectiva que planteó el profesor Hebert, y efectivamente considero que el acervo, la extracción, el almacenamiento, pero sobre todo el acervo, el tesoro de datos personales que hoy tienen las grandes plataformas, si las autoridades de competencia y de datos personales no encuentran una manera de que eso sea accesible de alguna manera, que no sé cuál es, por competidores, no va a haber competencia. Es imposible que haya competencia. El motor de búsqueda, el search de Google, no es que sea el mejor search, es que es el único search posible con la agregación del volumen de datos que ha logrado a lo largo de más de 2 décadas. Entonces, efectivamente, no fue el primero, sí fue, como dice Olavo, el primero que identificó, por motivos que, por ejemplo, el trabajo de capitalismo de plataforma de Zrníček bien identifica y estudia, es el primero que identificó el tratamiento de los datos personales y las búsquedas personalizadas como el nicho, el driver de su desarrollo y su motor. Ahora, ese es el driver de todas las plataformas, es lo que caracteriza a las plataformas. Y son muy talentosas, son muy buenas haciendo eso. Entonces, o renunciamos al principio de competencia, o vemos de qué manera esos datos, digamos, de qué manera nos hacemos una pregunta que es más de filosofía política, si ustedes quieren, que es, ¿de quién son esos datos personales? ¿Cuál es la soberanía sobre esos datos personales? ¿Es meramente de estas grandes corporaciones plataformizadas de Internet? ¿O hay algún otro tipo de... Yo creo que en los instrumentos legales que tienen los estados democráticos, hay elementos para cuestionar esa soberanía. Entonces, pero eso requiere una perspectiva más amplia de la que tienen, por una parte, las agencias de protección de datos personales por su lado, y las agencias de defensa de la competencia por su lado. Me parece que sí, es utópico, pero, digamos, dado el desarrollo que tienen estas plataformas, estamos hablando de avanzar sobre utopías, porque cualquier cosa que se proponga, o sea, la interoperabilidad que logró la industria de las telecomunicaciones a su pesar, a principios del siglo pasado, del siglo XX, es una interoperabilidad que yo también coincido que sería muy beneficiosa que se propusiera en el mercado de las plataformas. No es sencillo, eso es también, de alguna forma, algo utópico. Lo propuso Jack Dorsey, el fundador de Twitter, dice, bueno, con Twitter vamos a llegar a un nivel de interoperabilidad, pero ese principio de interoperabilidad supone un tratamiento de datos personales que rompa la lógica de tratamiento y almacenamiento de datos personales corporativo que existe hoy. Y yo creo que, para terminar, respondiendo también a lo que planteaba Olavo, ¿hay una bala de plata que solucione todo este problema? Creo que no la hay, que es un conjunto de medidas. Pero esta, sin dudas, es una de las medidas centrales.
Very good, Professor Becerra. What about your thoughts, Professor Hovenkamp?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for those comments too. On the first part of the question, my advice is to go slow. Two-sided markets and digital platforms have not been around for a long time. It took a century of economic analysis for us to acquire mature understandings of traditional markets. I hope it doesn't take that long with two-sided markets, but it probably takes longer than we have, and we still do not have a good consensus over how market power is measured, how it's relevant, what the consequences of various types of intervention are. And that is why, from my perspective, injunctions are usually safer remedies than structural remedies. Structural remedies can be very damaging, particularly if they break up challenged, established lines of communication or sharing, or take off productive efficiencies. Injunctions are usually less intrusive. The United States went through this with respect to the Microsoft case, where the initial proposals the government made were to break Microsoft up, and the DC Circuit ended up coming up with a set of much more modest remedies that governed Microsoft's conduct. On the second part of the question, having to do with information, yes, information is relevant to antitrust policy in several ways. Particularly, one area that's generally not involved here is sharing, where the challenge is to collusion. So, restrictive sharing of information between, say, two parties that refuse to share it with others, that could give rise to a fear of collusion. Information can also create threats of exclusion, and those are legitimate antitrust concerns. One of the difficulties we face today in the US, and we face it from both the left and the right, is the mixture of other concerns that I don't think fit into antitrust policy very well. One of them is privacy. I think Europeans in particular are right to put privacy more in control of consumers, but privacy is ultimately not a competition issue. It's an issue about human rights and individual priorities. And the other one is ideology. And here, what we're seeing, and that I find very disturbing, is a lot of attacks on the big digital platforms, but particularly Facebook, for coming up with policies that exclude certain people because of their ideology. I think that's an issue. I think it's an issue that needs to be addressed. I don't think the antitrust laws are a very good way of addressing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hovenkamp. So I might identify a seems to be a difference of opinion among our panelists with respect to one specific question. And I'd like to once again hear both of them, whether or not this perception is correct, and if it is or if it's not, whether there is indeed a problem. Mr. Becerra seems to understand that there's a substantive lack of competition among platforms. We need to create mechanisms for the main asset, which would be the information about the customer's preferences, should be somehow made available to other platforms, new entrants, that would be then able to compete. I think that Mr. Becerra mentioned that there's no competition. There can be no competition if the information is entirely controlled by these private entities. Mr. Hovenkamp, on the other hand, seems to understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, that competition is still possible from the perspective of antitrust, regardless of any consideration on who controls the information. There seems to be an understanding that it's possible to develop new ways to gather information, mainly because, or among other reasons, because information is not an asset that can be consumed. The customer's preferences will remain as the customer's preferences, regardless of whether or not someone has identified it, and regardless of whether or not a company has addressed the preferences with directed advertisement. So, is there indeed this difference of opinions among you? And at the end of the day, we are discussing whether or not antitrust is an end in itself, or do we recognize antitrust as an instrument to pursue broader objectives?
Bueno, por mi parte sí, creo que es correcta la caracterización que ha hecho Olavo, en el sentido de que sí creo que el control de la información, el control prácticamente monopólico de la información y de los datos de cada uno de los segmentos de los distintos mercados es un obstáculo bueno, insoslayable para la competencia. Creo más aún que en la economía digital, donde la predicción de prácticas y comportamientos de consumidores y de usuarios es un capital central, ese control de información se vuelve insustituible, es un capital insustituible para el éxito de una compañía. Y esto tiene relación con algo que hoy hemos abordado, que es la adquisición de startups, de compañías pequeñas, innovadoras, y quiero decir, el efecto, digamos, esa adquisición de compañías innovadoras que obstaculiza, en muchos casos, una dinámica innovadora en todo el mercado, es facilitada por el control de la información por parte de una sola gran compañía en un segmento determinado, por ejemplo, motor de búsqueda en Internet. Entonces, se transforma, y por supuesto hay muchos colegas que han estudiado este tema, se transforma en una herramienta anti-innovadora y anticompetitiva. Entonces termina siendo un problema de competencia también, además de ser de ser un problema básicamente democrático, el hecho de que empresas concentren tamaña cantidad de datos y de información pública. Bueno, termina siendo un problema de competencia porque obtura la posibilidad de surgimiento de competidores y obtura la posibilidad de competencia real porque nadie tiene la posibilidad de predecir el comportamiento de usuarios y de consumidores en un mercado como la tiene aquella compañía que logró la posición dominante.
Professor Hovenkamp?
Yes, thank you. I don't disagree with that. My point was that information was not that information cannot be used anti-competitively, because I believe it can be. It was that in the US, there's a tendency to confuse ideological uses of information or ideological suppression of information, which I believe is an issue, but not an antitrust issue, and then considerations of privacy. Where information can become exclusionary, then I think some kind of remedy under the antitrust laws is appropriate. I would simply say that given what we know about network effects today, interoperability remedies are likely to be much more successful than structural breakup remedies. That is to say, if we really believe that Google search has its dominance because of its very large database of information, then I believe the solution to that problem is to make the database more accessible by rival search engines so that they can use it. And then the search engines can compete in other ways. They can compete for advertising, for example, on the basis of rates, but not on the basis of their information database. I also don't think that every problem of the large digital platforms is necessarily an informational problem. I mean, the fact is there are a lot of exclusionary contracts in the large platforms. And I think the first and most direct line of enforcement is to get injunctions against those practices. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we have a few more minutes that I would like to offer to both of you, Professor Becerra and Professor Hovenkamp, for some final thoughts, some final remarks before our host, Henrique Faulhaber, can wrap up our panel. Oh. Please, Professor Hovenkamp.
Yes, so, okay, I was kind of waiting to see. Yeah, I think it's important to have some historical perspective when you start looking at the platforms. I think we are inclined to jump to very quick conclusions. And the fact is, we don't know enough about the platforms in order to be highly confident in our remedies. I'm also somewhat apprehensive about more aggressive regulation because at least in the US, the history of regulation has not been very favorable. It has tended to suppress innovation. And I think the one thing that always needs to be lurking in our mind when we are dealing with the platforms is that they are in fact highly innovative firms. They have generated a great deal of idea power in the world in the last several decades. And I don't think we want to get rid of that. So we have to take some pain to segregate the harmful effects from the beneficial ones. And then we have to tailor remedies in ways that suppress the harmful effects while preserving to the extent possible the beneficial effects. And that's why, like I said earlier, I think injunctions against proven anti-competitive practices, most of which are contract terms, by the way, injunctions are probably a promising first step rather than some more aggressive remedy that would involve breaking up these assets.
Thank you, Professor Hovenkamp. Profesor Becerra.
Por mi parte quisiera finalizar señalando que una coincidencia que tengo es que el tipo de conformación de estos mercados, en términos históricos, relativamente reciente, y sus efectos, su comportamiento y sus efectos, también relativamente reciente, nos convocan a ser cautelosos, pero algunos de los casos más resonados de abuso de posición dominante, que resienten el comportamiento de esos mercados y, en última instancia, dañan a los consumidores finales, el hecho de que haya posición dominante en el mercado mayorista digital de publicidad, que es algo que varias autoridades de la competencia, por ejemplo, la Autoridad de la Competencia del Reino Unido, ha documentado, verdaderamente con una constatación muy fina, muy bien respaldada, pues opera en sentido contrario a la cautela. Yo, como profesor universitario, como investigador, coincido con reunir la evidencia necesaria antes de actuar, pero es cierto que en el mientras tanto hay mercados enteros. Por ejemplo, en el caso del mercado publicitario mayorista digital, que acaparan Google y Facebook fundamentalmente, el sector de medios de comunicación en todo el mundo está impaciente reclamándole a las autoridades políticas respuestas inmediatas. Entonces, tenemos que lidiar también con la tensión que existe entre la necesidad de conocer en profundidad mercados muy novedosos, con efectos muy novedosos, y las respuestas de actores cuya existencia misma se haya comprometida por el abuso de posición dominante que ya está documentada en algunos mercados, por ejemplo en el mercado de la publicidad mayorista digital. Finalmente quiero agradecer nuevamente por haber realizado esta actividad que para mí fue muy formativa.
Gracias, Professor Becerra. Well, thank you again for both the panelists. It was a wonderful panel. I'm sure that all the audience learned a lot with the debate, and I myself would want this to continue for additional hours, but we don't have it. We have only a few more minutes, and I'll allow now our host, Henrique Faulhaber, to wrap up and close our panel. Thank you.
Obrigado. Obrigado, Olavo, professor Hovenkamp, professor Becerra. Tivemos aqui um painel excelente, discussão nessa manhã. A gente continua na parte da tarde, agora às 2 horas, vamos continuar discutindo o poder das plataformas, agora com a palestra da professora Annabelle Gower, da Surrey University, do Reino Unido, que vai ser mediado pela professora Mariana Valente, do Internet Labs. Muito obrigado a todos pela audiência, pela participação. Aqui no CGI estamos muito satisfeitos com o início dessas atividades aqui, que vão terminar no dia de hoje. Novamente agradecendo muito a todos. Uma ótima tarde. Um abraço.